Welcome to the CEC Report. It's the 12th of September. I'm Robert Barwick and I'm joined by CEC Organiser, Researcher and Victorian State Chairman, Jeremy Beck. Welcome, Jeremy.
Thanks, Robbie.
In this week's CEC Report, the news this week, Malcolm Fraser, the MH17 Black Box Report and the so-called moderate Syrian opposition, and then a special feature for this week's CEC Report on the 9/11 anniversary. 9/11 was an inside job. Are the Brits planning a new 9/11 inside job to get a war with Russia? But Jeremy, before we begin, we should mention, because we're being broadcast on Channel 31 in 3 states, that this week Malcolm Turnbull has just announced that he wants to crush community television. So we, the CEC, will be supporting the right of community TV to stay on air. This is a pretty shameless thing.
Sure is.
And I just want to remind viewers who Malcolm Turnbull is. This guy started off, he didn't just start his career, he guaranteed his career by having this early stint as the in-house lawyer for one of Australia's biggest media companies, Australian Consolidated Press Holdings, i.e. Kerry Packer and his TV station and magazine empire. And that career move guaranteed the rest of Malcolm Turnbull's career. So with that background, he's now the Communications Minister and he's going to crush community TV so that this channel can go to those big corporate media buddies of his.
I'm sure they wouldn't like us showing our show.
Well, that's the thing. I have a question for Mr. Turnbull. Is he scared of the voice of regular people in general or the CEC's CEC report in particular? Anyway, we'll monitor this and keep reporting it in future shows. But let's get on to this week's show. First of all, we're going to do a feature, which is why Jeremy's a special guest today, on 9/11, taking advantage of the anniversary of 9/11, which, as we're recording this, it's still 9/11 in the United States, the 13th anniversary. So before we do, though, there's a few other things that have happened in the news, and I just wanted to recap them, so report them briefly, so people know that they happened, because they're all very significant in their own right. So the big breaking news this week is that the former Prime Minister of Australia, Malcolm Fraser, has come out supporting a full Glass-Steagall separation of Australia's banks. And he did this in a submission that was made public last Friday to the Financial System Inquiry. Now, this is very significant. He's one of the, in fact, it makes him one of the highest ranking individuals worldwide to call for a restoration of the Glass-Steagall Act in the States and applying it more globally as the standard. You can read about it in the Australian newspaper today, the 12th of September, except the headline is wrong. They say Australian former PM backs call for ring fencing banks to protect investors. Well, he's not calling for ring fencing because ring fencing is not Glass-Steagall. He's calling for Glass-Steagall. And you can even see that in the quotes they have from him. He said, in a short submission to David Murray's Financial System Inquiry, Mr. Fraser, 84, stated he was firmly of the view Australia should not adopt the European policy of bailing in depositors when banks failed. Quote, instead, Australia should fully separate retail banking from the speculative activities of investment banks, which the Glass-Steagall law did in the United States so successfully from 1933 until its repeal in 1999, he wrote. So that's very, very explicit. And one thing that I know about Malcolm Fraser from research I've done is he was Prime Minister at the time, Jeremy, that the grandfather of this current Financial System Inquiry was put up, which was the Canberra Report back in the late 70s, early 80s. And he actually resisted those early attempts to totally deregulate Australia's financial system, which in my mind means he's got more credibility now than the people who did the deregulation that caused the crisis.
Well, of course, most of the deregulation occurred during the Hawke-Keating years.
That's right.
And then followed on, and the Liberals took over, and it's both the same, Labor-Liberal, Tweedledum, Tweedledee.
And remember, Julia Gillard called that, this agreement they have, the post-1983 Consensus on Economic Reform. And the reason that is significant is because the Prime Minister up until 1983 was Malcolm Fraser, who wasn't part of that consensus. All right, so that's good news. I want to mention also the report has come out from Britain of the contents of the black box of MH17. Now, this report essentially reveals nothing. it proves a few things though. It proves that the black box wasn't tampered with. And remember, Jeremy, in the first day and days, every Western government, including ours, was saying, "Oh, the Russians are creating this difficulty accessing the site, so they can take the black box to Russia and tamper with it." Right? Didn't happen. It was all rubbish, and this report does confirm that. But what it doesn't prove is that MH17 was hit by a surface-to-air missile, and because it doesn't prove that, it's just as likely it was shot at by another plane, in which case it would have been a Ukrainian jet. Either is just as likely. Our sources report, in fact, that the black box did contain more information, but it's information that contradicts the Anglo-American line, and therefore that has actually been suppressed. But very significantly, this week, coinciding with this report coming out, Russia's defence minister visited Malaysia and met with the Malaysian government and had a very friendly meeting, and then out of that, the Russians have offered Malaysia full support in its investigations. Now that tells you something about who the Malaysians think could be responsible for this, because they're obviously certainly not buying the line that it's all Russia's fault.
Definitely
All
not.
right. And then finally, in this news recap, this is very, very interesting, and we'll come back to it later in the show. We had the second victim of ISIS among these American journalists who, being publicly beheaded, Stephen Sotloff, which is a real tragedy. His family, though, was on CNN, a spokesman for his family on CNN on the 8th of September, reported that their son, Stephen, was being held by ISIS because he was sold to ISIS by who? The so-called moderate Syrian opposition. These are the people that Obama has just announced we're going to arm and support, supposedly to fight ISIS while he's bombing ISIS, yet they have this kind of relationship to ISIS where they willingly, for money, handed over this guy to be brutally executed, and they're the people that we're supporting. What it confirms is the widely held view by experts that inside Syria there is no such thing as moderates. That's just the reality there. And so we're being spun a line by the powers that be to get the war that they want to get going there. Anyway, so let's just stop there, because when we come back, we're going to talk about 9/11 as an inside job. Welcome back to the CEC Report. So on this 9/11 anniversary, the 13th anniversary of 9/11, we're going to discuss 9/11 was an inside job. Are the Brits planning a new 9/11 inside job for war with Russia? Now, Jeremy, if you pay attention to the international news, what you'll notice is the British elite are getting hysterically desperate. Now, last week when I was on here with Craig, the NATO summit in Wales had just started, and we said some things about that I'll recap on. Australia was over there being made an enhanced partner of NATO, which is ridiculous. If you look at it on a map, where we couldn't be further away from the North Atlantic. We're in the South Pacific, but this is actually aimed at China. However, we don't get into that. The Brits went there with this wish list of actions they wanted to take, and they got some of them up, but overall it was completely overshadowed by one thing. A ceasefire was agreed to in Ukraine, which is holding. Now, because this ceasefire is holding, the idea that Ukraine can be used by those who want NATO to attack Russia as the trigger is becoming less likely. And in fact, the president of Ukraine, Poroshenko, is actually looking at legislating to give Eastern Ukraine the autonomy that it's asked for. Right? So this is something that the Brits are not very happy with because of this reason. They want this war. And we reported last week that the British Parliament's House of Commons Defence Select Committee on the 29th of July issued a lengthy report entitled Towards the Next Defence and Security Review Part 2 NATO. Now what this report was prepared to position NATO for a war with Russia, but interestingly in the report it warns NATO must be prepared for another 9/11 attack. Now why is that important? Because the original 9/11 attack, which we're going to talk about, invoked NATO's Article 5, which is what governs military responses by NATO. And the way it works is if any one member of NATO is attacked, that's an attack on all members of NATO, and NATO will respond militarily. And so on 9/11, the United States was attacked. That invocation of Article 5 then, back in 2001, is the only time Article 5 has been used in NATO's history, right? The Brits want NATO to be prepared for a military response against Russia. They want NATO to militarily take on Russia. They're looking for a trigger for that, and they know it worked then, and they're saying that they're warning of another 9/11 because there are elites in Britain that want it now, right? So that's this is on this 9/11 anniversary. Thought, all right, let's recap what the original 9/11 was, so that everyone who views this show understands it was in fact an inside job, or what's called a false flag operation. And that's why, so Jeremy, you've done a lot of work on this, and so I've got some questions for you. As an inside job, this kind of thing, it wasn't the first, right? And we'll talk about that. But first of all, we work with the American economist Lyndon LaRouche. He actually forecast, I think in January that year, that 9/11 was something like 9/11 was going to happen, right?
Definitely. Well, you look at what he said. It was on the 3rd of January. He said that we're going to get a frustrated Bush administration. If it's determined to prevent itself from being opposed, its will, you're going to get crisis management, where members of the special warfare types, of secret government, the secret police teams and so forth, will set off provocations which will be used to bring about dictatorial powers and emotion in the name of crisis management. So that's what he said on the 3rd of January 2001.
And he said that because I remember at the time, he had a pretty good understanding of who had just come back into power in the Bush administration. He knew the pedigree of people like Cheney and Wolfowitz and Rumsfeld and the Attorney General Ashcroft. He knew these guys really well. And so that's why he issued that warning. And of course, it actually happened. Now, before we go into the actual event, I want to deal with some of the fact that it's happened before in history. So later on, after 9/11 happened, LaRouche called it America's Reichstag fire. So just explain what that means. What was the Reichstag fire?
Well, that was the way Adolf Hitler got his dictatorship. Hitler allowed the Reichstag fire to happen, probably actually caused it himself. It's a false flag style operation where he blamed it on the communists.
And that the Reichstag was the Parliament building.
That's right, in 1933, and it allowed Adolf Hitler to get his emergency decrees through, which is the equivalent of what we've got right now with the anti-terrorism laws.
Yeah, and I do know one interesting part of history is that when the Nazis, as the building was burning down, the Nazis were the first on the scene, Hitler was the first on the scene, and they'd actually invited the correspondent of a British newspaper chain owned by Lord Beaverbrook, which was the biggest newspaper chain in Britain. Their German correspondent was there to take the Nazi Hitler saying, this is the communists doing it, I need all these powers to take on the communists. And so within 12 hours, thanks to that reporter being there, that news went around the world that Germany was under attack by the communists, this guy Hitler's going to save them, etc. And it's worth noting because Lord Beaverbrook was the mentor of one Rupert Murdoch, right? And of course, if you know, we won't go into Murdoch too much, but his role from the original 9/11 on to justify the terror laws, to justify the Iraq War was very, very crucial. Now, there's another one though, which is more explicit in many respects because it shows, and it didn't happen, but it was planned, and this has come out from classified documents, or eventually declassified. So what was Operation Northwoods?
I've got the document right here. It's now declassified, of course, but it was an amazing plot by the Joint Chiefs of Staff to sabotage...
The US Joint Chiefs of Staff.
Yep, the US Joint Chiefs of Staff to sabotage US warships, have terror operations in US cities, and blame it on the Cubans in order to get a war going.
So what year is this?
This is 1962, 13th of March 1962. It's now unclassified. You've got plans here. For example, they said, we could blow up a US ship in Guantanamo Bay and blame it on Cuba. Or casualty lists in US newspapers would be a helpful wave of national indignation. We could develop communist Cuban terror campaign in the Miami area, in other Florida cities, and even in Washington. And the list goes on, and they go through a whole list of special operations which would make it look like Cuba's the bad guys, so in order to justify a war against Cuba.
Now, this was at the time, if anyone's ever watched the movie 13 Days, which documents the Cuban Missile Crisis, you'll see in that movie it quite accurately shows the standoff between Kennedy and this same Joint Chiefs of Staff, because a lot of people on the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the US at that time, they were pretty aggressive. So let's put it mildly. So this was at that time, and why didn't it happen?
Fortunately, President Kennedy looked over it and he said, "No way, we're not going with this." And fortunately, it didn't happen. Otherwise, a lot of innocent people would have lost their lives, and it would have been an operation like 9/11.
All right, well, let's take a break. When we come back, Jeremy's going to recap some of the timeline of 9/11 just to prove this idea that it was a false flag event. Welcome back to this special 9/11 anniversary edition of the CEC Report, where we're discussing 9/11 as an inside job or a false flag operation. So, Jeremy, before the break, we went through some precedents for 9/11, like the Reichstag fire and this Operation Northwoods that you've shown us. So let's talk about the actual event itself. And the timeline of it really does prove that there was an institutional decision when it was happening to look the other way. Just go through that.
Right. Well, remember, we're all probably watching it on TV as it happened, and you saw it unfold. You heard about the first plane, and you were watching the fire, and then you heard and you actually saw with your own eyes that the next plane went into the next tower.
So, and once we saw that, everyone saw that, we knew it was an attack.
Yeah,
the first one could have been an accident, but that was obvious right then.
It was obvious. Now, the times here, between 8:25 a.m. and 8:32 a.m., they already knew that there was a hijacked aeroplane. Flight 11 had been hijacked. It was reported by the Federal Aviation Administration's Boston Center. Now, the North Tower was hit at 8:46 a.m. and the South Tower
that could have been, by those, if it was 8, that could have been as much as 21 minutes later.
And then the South Tower was hit at 3 minutes past 9 a.m. Now, then, a long time later, it wasn't until 9:37 that the Pentagon was hit. Now, that's a long time. Now, there's Andrews Air Force Base, which is just a handful of kilometres, 18 kilometres away, and they could have got fighter jets up and protected the Pentagon, but nothing happened.
And how many times, there was a figure in our press release on this, in the previous year, how many times had planes been scrambled from Andrews to guide planes that had gone off course back onto course?
Well, there's reported 67 times of planes in the months preceding 9/11. So that was a routine event.
It's routine. This is what they do.
Yeah.
Right? So, and by that time, though, they know by this time, what is it? 9:03.
Yeah.
They know they're under attack. They know there's more planes that are hijacked.
Yeah.
Right? They were obviously tracking them, yet no plane from Andrews was scrambled to protect Washington.
Well, it take just a few minutes to get a plane up there from. It's just unbelievable.
Yep.
And as a number of experts have said, Paul Craig Roberts, who was the former Assistant Secretary of the US Treasury, he said, Washington's explanation of the attack implied a security failure too massive to be credible.
Now, you got some few more of those, but I just wanted to mention when it was happening, and as it was happening live, Lyndon LaRouche, who had forecast this kind of thing, not the specific event, but this kind of thing, he was live on radio in Utah at the time, and so he was commenting on radio, and he said straight away, this is an inside job. He said it will be blamed on
Bin Laden.
Osama bin Laden. And so, but you've just quoted Paul Craig Roberts. There are lots of other people of high stature who actually agree with what LaRouche said.
Oh, absolutely. We've got the former German defense minister. This is Andreas von Bülow. He's said for many, many years that 9/11 was an inside job. The way he puts it is, I know a lot of people, including very influential ones, who agree with me, but only in whispers, never publicly. And then, of course, we've had the British former Environment Minister, Michael Meacher, he said, could US air security operations have been deliberately stood down on September 11?
Yep.
And I think it's pretty clear they were.
Yeah, and of course what happened is this was so quickly turned into the campaign to attack Iraq, right, that all this material tended to get lost in the wake of all that. And plenty of people know about it. Plenty of people who are watching this show know 9/11's an inside job. But what we're trying to establish is it's a this kind of false flag event is a method, and it's a method in extreme times. Now, EIR had a few. Our news service, Jeremy with EIR, have had a few things to say about this. One is we've done a report which traces the whole thing, the money, because everything, you've got to follow the money trail for everything, to a very infamous arms deal between Britain and Saudi Arabia called the al-yamama arms deal, and it was hatched between Margaret Thatcher and a Saudi prince named Prince Bandar, who's the head of Saudi intelligence. This deal was an oil for planes deal, but it generated a slush fund into over $100 billion, and Bandar admits that funded Osama bin Laden, right? But the official US report into the 9/11 attack, to this day, still has 28 pages that are classified that the public are not allowed to see. And what are those 28 pages about?
Well, the Saudi role, and obviously they don't want the Saudis being in the spotlight. It's pretty clear. It was a British-Saudi operation, and the US government was complicit in covering it all up.
And there was a press conference yesterday in Washington with a very brave member of Congress named Walter Jones and members of the victims' families who are campaigning for those 28 pages to be declassified so the public can know this. And they're still in pain over it to this day, understandably. But to rub it into their face, John Kerry, the US Secretary of State, where did he commemorate 9/11 yesterday? In Saudi Arabia, where he negotiated a deal with the Saudis to help in this war on ISIS. And how are they going to do it? The Saudis have agreed that these moderates, who we just established at the start of this show are not moderates in Syria, can go to Saudi Arabia and train under these Wahhabis in Saudi Arabia to so-called fight ISIS. The whole thing's a joke. Jeremy, we're running out of time, but just briefly, 9/11 was used to usher in an extreme police state, as you mentioned. We're seeing another round of that right now. What's the Australian government planning with its latest anti-terror laws?
Big concern, because already the current anti-terrorism laws give the government, the ASIO and the various intelligence organisations numerous powers, and they want to increase the powers. We've got the National Security Legislation Amendment Bill number 1, 2014. It's now before Parliament. It will grant immunity from prosecution to ASIO and its affiliates for any crimes committed in the course of special intelligence operation. There's a whole lot of very severe jail sentences. These laws would potentially turn Australia into a police state Western Nazi Germany if they're fully implemented.
When you're granting immunity to your secret police, which is what they are, right, who function, frankly, as a branch of British intelligence, right, that is incredibly dangerous. Well, look, and the one thing we didn't mention much, but we always talk about here, this is all driven by the financial crisis. There was a real meltdown going on before the original 9/11. We're in another meltdown now, and the actual solution to this has to be a financial one, which is Glass-Steagall and economic development. But Jeremy, thanks very much, and thanks to the viewers for tuning in to this week's CEC Report. Tune in next week for more.